So it's day 645 of Vladimir Putin's 10-day special military operation. And since most of the major news outlets have let their Ukraine commentary wane a little bit, I thought I'd pick up from where I left off when I was doing Ukraine with Sky News. Let them concentrate on Israel-Hamas, but try and bring you a regular update, possibly weekly, possibly twice a week, on what it is that's going on, because I'm starting to see a lot of what I would call uninformed comment or bollocks being talked about, where Ukraine is, what Ukraine's position is, and what's happening on the ground. So let me just try and bring this into a degree of context. I'm going to use the mapping that's supplied by UK military intelligence. They put this out, it was coming out daily, it's coming out every few days, because what's happening on the front line itself isn't changing massively, but there are some significant activities going on. Now, as we get into this, too many people are measuring the success of the war on what is happening on the front line, the tactical battles, whether this red or pink shaded area on the map that we can see is shifting in Russians' favour, or whether it's shifting back in Ukraine's favour. And I think, and I will explain why I believe that is a very naive way of measuring the success of the operations. The Russians, starting from the north, are continuing with their attacks in the northern area that we see here, not making any real progress whatsoever. It's in through forested areas. They're coming against well-prepared Ukrainian defensive positions, and there's not much effort being put in there. That's really just a degree of probing. Ukraine continues to attack in around Bakhmut, and over the last few months has had a degree of success in this particular area, attacking into the north of Bakhmut and in from the south of Bakhmut, and capturing several kilometers of territory back, but not actually going into the town itself, because they saw how much of a problem that was for the Russians attacking into it whenever the Ukrainians held the town, and they don't want to replicate the same issues. They're happy to continue to keep the Russians focused on there, because it is in effect fixing the Russians in place. It's fixing the military capability there. It's fixing them psychologically. The Russians over the last day or so have had a little bit of success counterattacking back in certain areas, but we will see this continuous swing to and fro. But it shows that the Russians are still pumping a lot of capability into the area to try and maintain what they had captured in Bakhmut after over 12 months of Wagner fighting through there, and thousands and thousands of casualties, as well as thousands of pieces of equipment being destroyed. Where Russia's main effort seems to be at the moment is in the area of Avdiivka. And Avdiivka, effectively we have a salient where Russia has got the territory to the north of the town and territory to the south of the town. The town itself has been held by the Ukrainians since 2014, and has been effectively become an armoured stronghold. The Ukrainians still have good lines of communications into the town. The Russians are not interfering with those greatly, so they can resupply the troops that they've got in this armoured stronghold. But to the north of the town there is a big factory complex, metalworks, and all the rest of it, which is where the Russians are having a degree of success as they try and clear that out. However, it is at a massive cost. The Russians are losing thousands of troops a day. They're pouring more and more infantry into the battle, and gaining very, very little ground. And they're losing tens of armoured vehicles a day. They're losing 8 to 10 tanks. They're losing 8 to 10 artillery pieces, if not more. They're losing air defence equipment in the area, and they're just piling more and more and more into it. Again, from a Ukrainian position, it is a fixing operation. They are holding the Russians in place. They're fixing them in that area. and that complements the fixing operations that they're doing in Bakhmut. The Russians keep throwing lots and lots and lots of capability at these areas, but they're not making the sort of progress that you'd expect with what it is that they're throwing at it. The Ukrainians are holding them off, and looking at some of the Ukrainian statistics, there's almost 7 or 10 Russians to every 1 Ukrainian being killed in the area, and tens of more pieces of equipment. It's difficult to analyse because there is fairly good reporting of Russian casualties, both from the Ukrainian side and on wider open source intelligence channels. There's very little reporting on Ukrainian casualties. So again, that is a difficult one to assess. Ukrainians continue to have some successes down in the Zaporizhia area. We've got Zaporizhia here. They are continuing to attack down in towards the Russian defensive positions. They penetrated 2, if not 3, of the Suvorikin line of Russian defensive lines that are through this area, and these are minefields with anti-tank traps, covered by indirect fire, covered by direct fire in many places. It's probably one of the most comprehensive defensive belts that we've seen since the Second World War, and I'd argue even from during the Second World War, it's been more comprehensive than anything else. Again, slow progress, but would expect that on the front line. The one thing that is consistent about this whole area at the moment is that it is now being affected by the weather, because we've now got freezing cold conditions, but those freezing cold conditions aren't enough to make the ground freeze. The ground is still very, very boggy indeed, and that is not good for manoeuvre warfare, for armoured warfare. It is much better for those that are in defensive positions, i.e. majority the Russians, apart from in Avdiivka, where you've got the Ukrainians in defensive positions. It will result in a stalemate at that tactical level, because it's very difficult to make gainful advances and to try and capture more territory. If you sit there and do nothing whenever you're in a position like that, then you have got the stalemate that everyone talks about. But the Ukrainians are not doing nothing. And we also have to recognise that the Russians are in a very difficult position when it comes to the morale of their troops, their equipment of their troops, and the freezing cold conditions. They do not have the equipment, the logistic support, the leadership to keep morale high for the Russian troops that are sitting suffering in their trenches through the cold weather, and that's only going to get worse through the winter. Where the Ukrainians are making some tactical advances is in this area, down just opposite Kherson, across the Dnipro, and they have managed to get elements of a naval infantry brigade across the Dnipro River with some equipment, with some armoured vehicles, but light armoured vehicles, and they've managed to build from what was a little almost raid into a bridgehead that the Russians have been trying to deal with for a couple of months now. The Russians have been trying to attack in to deal with it. The Ukrainians are making very clever use of FPV drones, in particular in this area, to destroy Russian indirect fire, their artillery, and any Russian armour and equipment and vehicles that are coming in to try and carry out tactical attacks against the area to shift them across. And the Russians are not having any success. Now, what this means is, if we're looking at the whole of the front line, this whole front line that's here is over 600 kilometers long, and the Russians cannot concentrate their reserve forces in a way to give them an advantage in any particular area that's there. The Ukrainians are keeping the Russians spread out all over the place, whilst the Ukrainians are having an increasing amount of success in destroying troops, equipment, artillery, air defence, engineer capability, and effectively Russia's tactical capability on the ground. Russia is now having to field more and more new units. Those new units are badly trained, badly equipped, and being fed into what's increasingly being seen purely as a meat grinder. Russia's two main efforts are Avdiivka and, it seems, Bakhmut. The Ukrainians are sort of south of Zaporizhia and trying to split that land bridge again. But also, I'm keeping a very close eye on this bridgehead they've got across from Kherson, because we may see that develop a little bit more into what is defensively Russia's soft underbelly, and again could influence the lines of communication coming up from Crimea up through here to be able to resupply all the Russian troops that are in these sorts of areas here and further up. So it's very, very important for the Ukrainians. So from a tactical perspective, not much movement on the front line, a lot of things happening on the front line, and the Russians seem to be coming off worse. When it comes to what's happening and why the Russians haven't got the ability to go forward, the Russians still have an element of air maneuverability. They're getting their air force more involved, but they're having to get them more involved in tactical operations, and the Ukrainians are shooting more down. The Russians heavily overmatched 645 days ago, heavily overmatched Ukrainian artillery on the ground. We're now getting to almost parity, because Ukraine has got longer range and more accurate artillery capability that's there, and the use of FPV drones by both sides is significant. Ukraine seems to be having a bigger success with those than elsewhere. The thing the Russians have got at the moment that is providing them greatest success is, as I said, that air and aviation capability, but also their electronic warfare capability. They've got significant electronic warfare that is disrupting a lot of what Ukraine is doing from a tactical perspective. So if I was Ukraine, where would I be focusing myself on? I'd be focusing myself on Russian air defenses, Russian electronic warfare, continue on Russian artillery systems, and then try and get my operational level to attack airfield and aviation assets and try and degrade those. Surprise, surprise, that's what we're seeing is happening. And what I think we're going to see happen more as we come into the winter months and as things develop, we're going to see the Ukrainians doing much more of this, supporting what they're doing tactically on the front line, with the attacks, the tactical attacks, helping to destroy and rip down Russian armor and Russian artillery, using HIMARS, using Scalp and Storm Shadow missiles to attack into Russian logistics, and these symbols are really just placed for illustrative purposes only. They aren't accurate. Not just inside occupied Ukraine itself, but also inside Russia. And we've already started to see some indications of this, but I think we're going to see through the winter months an increased amount of Ukrainian activity, drone activity. We'll see a big surge of into Russia itself, attacking military bases, lines of communication, railway sites, and we'll see an increased amount of special operations executive type operations going on as well, attacking into these different areas to try and disrupt Russia's ability to move military capability into its rear areas to support the tactical battle. Effectively, what we're seeing is the Russian military being hollowed out from behind, and attacks going into those very vital helicopter assets and air assets that are still having an impact on the front line, as well as attacking the air defense assets. Because remember, Ukraine is starting to prepare itself for the arrival of F-16 fighters at some stage, and the more the Russian air defense is degraded, the more the F-16s will be able to have a better influence on that front line as we come into the new year. In addition to that, and especially because of the psychological impact that there will be, I suspect in the winter months we will see the Ukrainians starting to attack again, and again these arrows are illustrative, attack again into Crimea to try and show to the Russians that Crimea is not a safe place for them to be. We've seen recent storms and storm damage in there, disrupting some of the defences that the Russians have around the Kerch Bridge area, and the Ukrainians may try and exploit that. We've seen the Ukrainians have such successes against the Russian Navy, a country without a navy, sink more capital ships than have been sunk since I think the Falklands crisis was the last one, and potentially more since the Second World War, forcing much of the Russian Navy to move away from its Crimean ports across into Russian ports. But it shows that Russia does not own the Black Sea, and Ukraine is still continuing to export grain that is still feeding the world, and Russia and showing Russia's impotence in being able to try and stop that. So there's a lot going on at the moment, and the lack of movement from a tactical perspective on the frontline battlefields is by no way an indication of the successes that are going on. Ukraine's continued hollowing out of the Russian capability behind that, the way it's writing down Russian tactical capability and operational capability, is significant, and it is that will have a significant impact next year. We shouldn't let lack of movement on the front line cause any problems from a political perspective, because next year is going to be politically really quite difficult anyway, given the fact that we've got the US presidential elections, and as a much smaller sideshow, UK parliamentary elections coming up as well, potentially. I would argue possibly autumn sometime, around the same sort of time as the US presidential elections. But a lot going on, and a lot going on a daily basis. This is a general overview. I will try and focus this down a little bit more, and if there's anything of any real detail I need to go into, please feel free to ask me some questions. I'll look at that, and I'll try and get this as a regular output. But thank you very much indeed for listening. That's me. Hopefully at some stage soon you'll see me back in the Sky Studios. You will see me on Talk TV fairly frequently, talking about not just Israel Hamas, but a lot of other things that are happening around the place, and find me on lots of other channels. But until next time, thank you very much indeed.